Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today on our webinar on the state of compliance in 2026. I'm Eric Morehead, Vice President of Advisory Services at LRN, and we're really glad to have all of you here today to talk about the state of compliance in 2026. Before we get started, I have a few quick housekeeping items about the webinar today. You will see a Q&A section at the bottom of your page. Please submit your questions there, and please submit your questions at any time. We'll attempt to answer your questions in context as they come in while we're having our discussion. I think that's the best way to try to make this as interesting and interactive for you as possible. And normally we'll say that we'll reserve some time at the end to provide some time for question and answer. But we have a pretty packed agenda today, so I don't know that we'll have much time to answer questions. But if we don't, our team will make the best efforts to follow up with you afterwards to make sure you get your answer. But please do participate and ask us questions as we go along. We're here to talk about the state of compliance here in 2026. I think I not feeling too differently than a lot of other people in saying that compliance and the state of compliance feels complicated right now. We have expectations, as always, risks hitting us from every direction. We have stakeholders, regulators, board members, employees, and the public at large all kind of looking at organizations and asking a lot of hard questions. And at the same time, technology, including AI, are really changing the risk landscape for compliance and making things more difficult and with programs that are already under stress. The main question that we hear a lot here at LRN, and I know that you're getting asked a lot is, what does an effective compliance program even look like in 2026? And so that's what today is about. We're going to talk to some professionals that really are in the trenches to get kind of the boots on the ground idea of how organizations are handling these issues, where things are working, where things aren't working. And again, really looking forward to you participating as well with any questions you have. To get this done, I'm really pleased to be joined today with a couple of warriors from those trenches, those compliance trenches. Adam Balfour and Miriam Block have agreed to join us in our discussion today. Miriam is head of ethics and business integrity learning, knowledge management, and industry shaping. A lot of hats there for North America at Sanofi. And Adam is vice president and general counsel for corporate compliance and data privacy across the Americas and EMEA at Bridgestone. Miriam and Adam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Excited for the conversation, Eric.
I am excited as well. Thank you.
Yes. So let's jump right in. Again, in the introduction, I mentioned that things seem more complicated, at least to me, today than maybe they did a few years ago. When you two step back and look at where we are now, what feels most different about compliance today versus, say, 2 or 3 years ago? I'll pitch that to you, Miriam, first, if you don't mind, and tell me sort of what your perspective is.
Sure. So, when I think of when I started in this field, compliance was really a policeman. We were the no, we were looking for the problem, we were the blocker. And I think the function has evolved to much more of a business partner model, trying to find that seat at the table, trying to help people get to yes. So stay within the regulatory boundaries, but really finding ways that we can enable the business. I think that's for me the biggest shift of what I've seen in the function over the past few years.
Sure, sure. And Adam, is that jibe with your perspective over the last few years?
I think it definitely does. I mean, I think maybe some of the other things that I've noticed in the last few years. One is I don't think you can attend a conference now and where there's a session that doesn't mention AI at least about 50 times. So I do think that has just been something that the last 2 or 3 years we've really talked about, but it's also gone from, I think, kind of idea, either this is the best thing or this is doom and gloom, to now I think we're in a much more practical state of, where people are using this and where we're not. And I'm sure we'll come back to that a little bit later. But some of the other things I've noticed, I think the last couple of years, I was at the Compliance Week National Conference last week. I got to see Eric's wonderful colleague, Ty Francis, a dear friend. And there we actually heard from some of the regulators, which I think is always extremely helpful. I do think the last few years it's been a little bit challenging because we haven't heard from them as much. Whereas I think regardless of your politics, always so helpful to hear from the regulators. What are they thinking about? What's kind of there on their mind? How are they approaching things? And then I think the other one thing I've noticed, particularly within the last year or so, is a number of like really talented, experienced compliance professionals who are now in the job market. And so I do think we're starting to see that ripple effect, which is really unfortunate to see. But these are great people who will land great roles. I think the last thing I'd mention here, Eric, is that the one thing that I try to keep in mind for myself is not to dismiss the many headwinds or the challenges that we're facing as a profession or even individually. But I think every single time is always a time of uncertainty. And so I try to take a little bit of a step back at times to think about this is a period of time. And even if enforcement actions are down, that will come back, things will change, this too shall pass. So I try to think about what's happening in the moment, but also kind of take a step back and think about things in the bigger picture as well.
You make a good point there, Adam. And had some experience in a regulatory agency years ago. And the one thing that I know is dangerous right now, and a lot of compliance officers are having trouble communicating to the commercial side of the business, is that this is cyclical, and that while, the message right now seems to be the rules don't apply the way they did a few years ago, that can snap back pretty quickly. Um, any advice to our fellow compliance warriors out there about communicating that message that this as you said, this too shall pass?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point, right? And I think all of us probably in our presentations, whether it's to senior leadership or the board, I use a lot of headlines of other companies. This is what we're seeing. That's a little bit different right now. But the one thing that I've tried to do for years is to think about regulators. They are a really important stakeholder in our program, but they are not the only stakeholders. And so I think right now it's maybe a little bit more challenging if for people who've over-indexed on kind of the threat of enforcement. And what I've been trying to do for years, and I think a lot of people are having to do this right now, is showing one, there's many other stakeholders in our programs, right? You get shareholders, your customers, your employees. They, I think, are as important stakeholders as are any regulators. And so I've tried to kind of think about that, but also showing building out our compliance program, one, because that's what our jobs are, but also trying to connect it to some other areas within the organization. So I know a topic that Miriam and I talked about before in our planning conversations was psychological safety. And that I think ties in so much to areas such as safety or creativity, driving innovation. And so I think it's just how do we frame this? So we're having to kind of work a little bit right now, I think, on like how we brand our programs and our sales skills, which can be challenging. But even when the enforcement actions come back, I think those skills that we built up right now and how we frame our programs, that's going to help us out in the longer term.
Let's build on that, because priorities continue to shift. And figuring out, I mean, the one constant is not a lot of resources. So how are you guys handling those shifting priorities and deciding where to focus your time and your limited resources? Miriam, how are you making those hard choices?
We're, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about business enablement. Like we're trying to focus our resources where we can enable the business within the appropriate regulatory framework. And as Adam mentioned, we talked a lot about psychological safety, and creating those safe spaces where people can come to us and ask when they get to that gray area.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things we're doing on the communication side, we never really measured our engagement prior. And our communication prior to now was focused on enforcement action. It was focused on rule changes. And now we are thinking more of doing things to engage people. So we started this monthly "What Would You Do" communication that we put out, the Viva Engage. And it's a topic, let's say conflicts of interest. What is it? Why is it important? Where do you go if you need to report a potential conflict? Oh, and by the way, let's test your knowledge, but we're not testing your knowledge to grade you. Here's some real world scenarios. What would you do? You know, thinking of the John Quinones sort of philosophy, you can opt in or not. But here's 3 to 5 real world scenarios. Obviously, we changed the details to protect the innocent or the guilty. And if people do them and they say they got 100%, they can come back to our original post. We use Viva Engage, and we do a lottery for Bravo points. So we're not punishing people for not participating, but we're rewarding people for starting to think through the process. So another way to engage us and become a partner and create that psychological safety without actually getting in front of anybody face to face.
And Adam, where have you been focusing here in say the last 12 months?
Yeah, and I do love the point that Miriam brings up that I think it's definitely changing the perception and the perceived value of compliance. So we're not there just to catch people when they've done something bad, but it's to help them do the right and expected thing because I think most people they want to do the right thing, right? But they have got a job to do. They're under pressure. So how we continue to position ourselves that way, I think is such a great point. I think for me, how I've tried to think about kind of priorities over the last year or so. One is a very simple point, but I always try and remind myself that there really can only be one number one priority. You can't have 10 number one priorities, right? That just doesn't work. So I do think is for us really to think about what is the impact that we want to have on our organization. And then how do we use our time based on how many people do you have? How many hours really does your team have in the year with the resources you have? How to use that most effectively? And so I think it's really kind of coming up with an intentional plan that you still have to be able to adapt when things come up. But really having, I think, a very kind of thoughtful approach and communicating that with others. But some of the other things I've thought about a lot and we've done in the last year or so is really looking at how can we leverage technology more? How does that tie into what we're doing with our risk registry? Thinking about what those risks are, who are the people that can manage, mitigate, or amplify risks, and then what's the data that we're using to track that? And even thinking a little bit differently, like maybe these are some of the KPIs we've always used. Are there much more effective and meaningful KPIs and metrics? So we're trying to, I think, kind of think through some of these things. And so that's why, even though I think we are in a challenging time, I also see a little bit of the opportunity for us to try and think about how do we build our programs to be more relatable, more understandable, more connected to the business as well. Because if we're not connected, then that really just brings a whole lot of challenges and problems.
Yeah, no, a theme that is running through this conversation already, and I think runs through pretty much any conversation that I have about effective programs is, being a partner instead of like we were saying, we can't be perceived as the compliance can't be perceived as the cop, because that's going to cut off all meaningful, uh, interaction, with the commercial side of the business. Um, Talking about resources and marshaling those resources and making sure that you're doing what's impactful and effective, effective being our buzzword, right? Um, I still see a lot of programs that measure activity, like how many people have completed the required training, rather than outcomes. Uh, Adam, let's start with you on this one. How are you thinking about effectiveness? How are you measuring in a way that isn't just measuring activity.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point. This is something we've thought about with our program for several years. And I think it does relate to our activities, how we're measuring it. But I really think for me, it was a mindset shift as well. I like to think a lot in terms of analogies. It's how I think, how I learn, how I process things. And the analogy that kind of comes to mind here is I've got a treadmill in my basement, right? I can get on that thing and run on it for, I was going to say 2 hours. I can't do 2 hours anymore, but let's say 45 minutes or an hour, maybe even 30 minutes, if I'm being honest. I'm putting in all sorts of effort and activity. After that period of time, I'm still in the same place. And so I think we have to really think about, are we moving forward and what does that really mean? So one thing I changed actually a few years ago was our one of our pillar names. So we went from training and communication, which is still the wording that the DOJ uses, we changed it to learning and engagement. And it sounds like a very small shift, but really what the reason we made that change was when we're thinking about training and communication, it's did I as did we as the compliance team, did we send the training? Did we send out the communication? We've all sat through trainings where that don't result in learning. We all receive, I don't know how many emails that just aren't engaging us. So we really changed that to focus on, are people learning? Are people being engaged? And that was helpful because it really made us think differently. It's not simply how many people did we roll an online training out to, but what was the impact? But also, what I found to be incredibly helpful, particularly in the learning space, was once you think about, am I helping people learn? I think it opens up so many more opportunities because we start to think less about just simply the classroom type learning of PowerPoint presentations, online trainings, to now thinking about there's so many other ways in which people can learn. It's through, experiential learning, it's through coaching, it's through mentoring. So having that shift, I think it does change what you're doing, how you're thinking about things, but also just gives you a lot more ways in which you can make compliance programs feel a lot more natural and something that we do encounter on a daily basis.
Yeah, I feel like when you talk about training, it's sort of like medicine, right? So I like the idea of saying learning, it's kind of has more growth potential than training. Uh, it really it speaks to a different initial mindset of what the activity is. I like that a lot. Miriam, this is kind of your area. You're responsible for training. Tell us how you guys are measuring your effectiveness there.
So,
Um,
we have definitely shifted our approach. A lot of what we did previously was um, webinar type things where we had the presentation and somebody was speaking, sometimes in nauseam, and
a
it would
lawyer
record
probably.
what?
A lawyer probably.
Probably. And we would record that and push that out. If you didn't come, you still had to take your medicine, right? You had to play back this long listening monotone, obviously getting the message out, but not in an engaging type way. Um, we do partner with LRN. One of the things we did this year for the first time was role-based training. So everybody got their medicine, but it was sort of choose your own adventure medicine. So we covered off on our risk, but the scenarios you got, if you were in sales or in medical or in home office, they were different. They could be talking about speaker programs, but the interaction was really based on the interaction you were going to have as opposed to just some generic scenario. So I think that's, changed the how you take your medicine. Um, I also personally last September got certified as facilitator of Lego Serious Play. And you're probably thinking, Lego, compliance, how does that sort of fit together? Um, but it has
No,
really
no
given
pun
us
intended.
that was not intended at all. And with the last name of Block, me and the Legos, yes. But being able to bring the Legos, and my bag isn't next to me, normally it is. The whole idea is the idea of kinesthetic learning, hands stimulate brain, and your your hands know more than your mind. So bringing the Legos into different compliance type topics and getting people to build and use metaphor to share. Most recently, I was in Miami a couple of weeks ago with some senior medical leaders. We went over some of their survey results. We talked about thoughtful risk taking, our decision making model, leadership, speak up, psychological safety, and we were able to use the Legos. And we created psychological safety by just asking the simple question, build something that you're comfortable sharing with your peers that they may not know about you. And people's hands are going, they start talking, there's a lot of dialogue. We ask them the question of build what leadership means to you. And you had a room of senior medical leaders who suddenly had 19 different perspectives on what a leader looks like, and they weren't talking necessarily about themselves. And because you had this Lego model, it becomes depersonalized. So it's been a very new, interesting approach. I piloted a psychological safety and trust workshop in Canada in March for 24 people, and I became known as the Lego lady in Canada just by word of mouth. And I'm going back in June and delivering a similar workshop 3 days in a row because there was so much desire, and we're creating the safe space for people to speak up, to create the innovation, to raise the red flag when they see something in the gray area that they're not sure where to go. A very different approach to compliance training, but it seems to be working and it's gaining traction.
That's really, I mean, it's really taking it far away from the traditional training that trigger when you say that to a population and they think of, oh, I'm losing an hour of my time or 2 hours of my time. Instead, it's approaching them in a completely different way. I think that's really a great way to approach it. There's another audience that's a tough audience around learning, and that's the leadership. I'm curious, Adam, what kind of data or information about the effectiveness of the program, including learning, but also other aspects. What gains traction with the board, with leadership of the organization to show effectiveness?
Yeah, and I see there's actually a comment as well. I'm disappointed we're moving on from talking about Lego. I mean, I feel like we could spend a lot more
Oh,
time on
yes.
that, but I fear that Eric, you and I may descend into a path of terrible dad jokes that we will never get out of. So we'll move on from that. I think back to your question. For me, in terms of data that I think makes an impact for whether it's senior leadership, whether it's the executive team, or even if it's the board. The one thing that I have really embraced, and it's another kind of little bit of a mindset, but it's data, insights, and action. And so one of the other analogies, and I know it's one that Ty likes, but I used to run a lot, and I remember some of the Garmin running watches that people, and I had one, but not the most expensive. Like 20 years ago, people were spending 900, almost $1,000 on some of these watches. It would give you data like stride length on each leg, oscillation time off the ground. I don't know anyone who became a better runner because of that data. They just became more boring runners because all they would talk about is stride length and all those types of things didn't actually help them move forward in a faster, more productive way. So I try and think about that when we're tracking data or we're presenting it to others, just giving them a bunch of data that they can't draw insights from and they can't take actions. Actions could be, let's continue doing something, let's stop doing something, let's do something different. And so that's really been one of the kind of the mindset approach that I've tried to take. So some of the things I've done as a result of that is, with the board, I've made sure that I've met with every single member of the board before. So when I go and present my dashboard and we're talking about, the number of reports to the ethics helpline, they understand why we're showing things such as the anonymity rate. We're showing, the substantiation rate. What does that mean? Because without that, they're incredibly smart people, but they don't necessarily see compliance from our perspective or understand what that means. So helping them understand how it fits together. But I also think right now it's really important for us. partly because of the lack of enforcement action, for us to really show how compliance connects to the business. And so I think that's where we can, provide them with some very helpful information, whether that's data from our surveys, whether that's data about, hey, we're not seeing this part of the business. We're not seeing a lot of reports. That's a concern, right? And so maybe asking some of those questions, how are they doing on their business results? Is there a lot of pressure? Maybe we should go look into that. So really trying to help them understand what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, and also I think really helping senior leaders to exercise their roles and really have appropriate oversight and governance for the organization.
Yeah. Um, that that connect, we were talking earlier about the having a strong connection with the commercial side of the business, but same is true for the leadership, is they've got to, if you don't have them, right behind you, then you're not going to have a successful program. That's for sure. Miriam, from your perspective, you're doing some unique things. What's gaining traction with your leadership, that you guys have been doing? What resonates with them that you found?
What the conversation that keeps coming up is, how do we give people more time to do what they're supposed to be doing, right? So doing their real work. So how do you reduce training, right people, right time, reduce duplicity in messaging, whether that's through training, communications, or some other medium? Um, where can we automate? And not automate in a way that's going to eliminate roles, but automate in a way to make people more effective so they can take on additional, more meaningful, higher level tasks. Um, One example recently that we've been talking about is, what tools can we give our commercial folks who are in the field who spend so much time in their cars? What types of tools can we give them, use of AI or other, that they can document their call notes, they can practice what they're about to do, all things that would be safe while driving, instead of listening to a podcast. What can we give them
Mhm.
to prepare them for their next interaction as part of their existing going through the day, as opposed to now you need to be back at your desk to be able to prepare for what you're going to do in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So things like that, and I think this is where we're seeing a lot of AI coming in. And how do we use AI at the same time? How do you use AI and still use your brain? Just because AI has said it doesn't mean it's really the Bible. And so that responsible use becomes part of the conversation as well. And how do I prompt? What do I do with the prompt? How do I verify the information is accurate, for example? How do I recognize the hallucinations? And using all those things to make people more effective and give them the time to do their day job, because that's what we keep hearing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And we can't resist it, the discussion of AI, Adam. It's come up again. As you point out, AI is omnipresent. Let's tease that out a little bit. Do you see value, to use AI in a program, AI for analytics? What's your take on that, Adam?
Yeah, I 100%. I think it can be useful. I use AI every single day of my life, right? Whether it's for work, or if it's just for personal things. I think it's incredibly useful. I really do. And where it's helped me is, look, I'm a lawyer by background. I until recently had never put together a Power BI dashboard. I'm never going to share that Power BI dashboard with any of you because you would laugh at how bad it was. But it was also helpful that AI is helping me to do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And I get some of the concerns people have, whether it's hallucinations, Although I heard someone speak a little over a year ago, and they said hallucinations are they're a feature. They're not necessarily a flaw because sometimes you need AI when it's got two data points to kind of bridge the gap. Sometimes it's going to make stuff up. Other times it's going to be incredibly helpful. So knowing kind of where hallucinations are, where they can be helpful for creative purposes, but also other times, and we've seen particularly law firms that have found themselves in a lot of trouble because they have prepared materials for courts that have been, generated fake cases. So I think it can be extremely helpful in a number of areas. But also I think there's some areas where I'm like AI is a tool. And so, I've heard a lot of people talking about, well, we'll just take all your policies and put them into AI. I'm leading a big project right now where we're transforming policies, and what we're doing is really making them, I think, much clearer, much more human in tone, and really kind of helping guide people, which I think is a consistent theme that I'm hearing from Miriam and how she's taken such a great approach with her program. And so we want to really kind of clean up the policies first. And then at that point, they can go into AI. So I think it's trying to use it in a thoughtful, intentional way. But also, I don't want it to be that AI replaces all human to human conversations. We
Mhm.
still need to have that. And so we still need to have leaders and managers talking to their teams, not hiding behind AI or saying, well, I can create an avatar video and that can do it for me. No, no, no. You still need that human to human contact, I think is really key. And I think that the last thing I'll mention here is, one thing I've been thinking about with AI recently is I think it can be helpful for compliance purposes, that it can be very helpful there. And this is something I think Miriam just alluded to because we still need people to think. I do worry at times. How is it going to impact more on the ethics side? There was a study done, I think it was about 18 months or so before, where it showed that people were very comfortable asking AI to do unethical things that they themselves wouldn't do, or they wouldn't ask another person. So I think it's to think about AI may support more on the compliance side. How is it going to help on the ethical side? And are people still thinking in the right way? And really kind of thinking through things in the proper way. So at the end of the day, it's a tool. You can use any tool for good. You can use it for bad.
Yeah, I wanted to go back also to something you said at the top of our conversation today that reminded me, uh, you know, we're talking about AI. Everybody's talking about AI, and I worry. Um, I used to always say when I started my journey in compliance 15 some years ago, maybe more closer to 20 now. Uh, at that time, the big target was anti-corruption. The Justice Department had ramped up prosecutions in the early 2000s and had really gone after that. And I always worried when I peered inside organizations' compliance programs that there was all the oxygen was going towards this one risk. And I guess my fear, as somebody who is not completely bought in yet, still on the fence about AI, is that all the oxygen is going towards AI tools, and um, I worry that organizations are going to miss something because there's just this, okay, this is the solution, and it's not, like you said, a tool or an evolution of the program, but it's the solution. When you talk to other compliance folks, do you have that fear too about their perception of AI?
I think it's a really good point. I don't know if anyone's necessarily brought it up to me, but I think it goes back to kind of what I mentioned earlier about I think it is important for us to really think about our priorities and the impact we have. I think it's AI is there. I think in some ways it's a mistake not to look at how AI could help your program and help your colleagues as well as they're working with and within the program. But also it's not the solution to everything. And so I think it's trying to kind of keep that in context. But also during tough times, I think sometimes we want to look to the more advanced, But sometimes you've also just got to go back to the basics and really think about what is it, the purpose of a compliance program? Let's keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen whether it's AI, another pet peeve of mine, I would say, is codes of conduct. I think codes of conduct have lost their purpose. And I think we really need to say, is it really helping people to have a 40, 50, 60-page code of conduct that covers topics that are then addressed by other policies? I don't care if it's done in a nice, flashy way, if it's on an internet site. I don't think that's particularly helpful. And so I think this is something we've probably seen in maybe in cycles with compliance. But we do have to watch out because at times we may get too focused on one thing, and then that means we're missing some of the other things as well.
Yeah. Miriam, your thoughts on that? Is there a danger, do you see with your colleagues of over focus on this flashy new tool?
I think the danger is deploying it everywhere as opposed to where does it make sense. Um, I was having a conversation in the past week with a colleague about expenses, and AI can check all your expense reports, right? Um, but there are things that I would notice that don't seem right if I was actually so what is where do you use AI? What is threshold where you say, you know what? We need human intervention because the expense is this high or the risk, you brought up anti-corruption earlier. Is that risk so big, whether it's reputational or otherwise, that maybe it's a place where we need to have human intervention because the machine learning isn't catching everything
Yeah.
because we can only train it to so much. I am definitely a proponent of AI. I think where we need to help the business is how do you prompt? How do you set the appropriate prompt to get the information you want? And how do you continue to refine that? The first answer you get may not be the best response, and you may still save time, be more efficient, get to the appropriate compliant endpoint, but it's not the first thing that you get. You need to read what you've received. Ask it some more questions.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite things I do with AI now is I tell it my problem and I say to the AI agent, tell me what questions I should be asking you
Hmm.
to get to the solution I'm looking for, as opposed to thinking I have all the answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
This
I've heard that before, and that's a good approach.
I
Um,
feel like the conversation, there's an academic, she's written a number of books. I believe her name is Sherry Turkle. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it was something about she made a comment years ago. It was like, I'm less concerned about computers thinking like humans and more about, humans acting like computers. And I think that's kind of part of it right now. It's that use the technology, but it's find it in a way that's productive, it's intentional, and it's balanced. Because I think Miriam's right. It's like you have to challenge AI. Otherwise, I think it's almost as a form of isolated decision making. And I've said for years, I'm like, isolated decision making, good intentions, and pressure. Those are the ingredients for some epic disasters. And so I think it is when people get that feedback from AI, maybe it's not just taking it at its word, but going and saying to someone else, like, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm what AI suggested. What do you think? And so I think we just need to really continue to have some of those conversations around AI. The only other thing I was going to mention here as well is whether or not people think they're using AI. Your program is using AI.
Yeah.
And that's in, vendors are using it in all sorts of places. And the other thing I think we have to do right now is learn what are the questions we should be asking vendors. It's not simply does your product or tool have AI, but it's asking more about what is it what is the purpose, what does it do, what type of model you're using for it. So I think really building up our knowledge so that we can really understand where AI is being used is a really important thing for us right now as well.
I
Yeah.
think
And this is,
Adam,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Miriam.
I think I think one of the things that you didn't say, but it came to me was AI is giving us an extra blind spot sometimes because we are taking it on face value. So having that human to human interaction and having that conversation after helps to mitigate that blind spot because AI said so.
Yeah. And just to tie a bow on this, we did have a question from one of our audience members. My organization is very bullish on AI, suggestions to infuse legal guardrails to help us make the right decisions without dampening the overall enthusiasm. I think, what I would say is echo what Adam just said, which is ask a lot of questions, figure out how it's being used, not only by people in your organization, but your vendors and other third parties, as Adam and Miriam both have pointed out. I think you got to get your arms around it first before you can try to figure out what the parameters are going to be.
And what are the vendors doing with your data
Yeah,
that you're giving them to their, you're training their AI with your data.
yeah, yeah,
Well, and
yeah.
I think some of this as well is it's having conversations. If you're in an organization where people are very, very bullish, I don't think you can really resist that necessarily, but I think a lot of it is education and conversation. Some of that may be driven by compliance. Some of it I think really should be driven by IT, or if you're fortunate enough to have like a chief AI officer. But I have four young kids, which, in case anyone's thinking, yes, that is a lot of kids. But I remember like seeing one of my kids holding a hammer, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is going to end in broken fingers or a disaster. So I think it's like a hammer can be an incredibly useful tool, but it's how to use it and for what purpose. So I think that's really where we need to help people understand what AI are you using? And then how confidential is it? Is it truly staying within your organization? Are the prompts going outside, even if the responses are staying inside? So it's just having those conversations, because if people are being pressured to use it by senior leadership, they're going to be using it. So how do
Yes.
you try and help support them to use it in a productive way for the organization, for the business results, but also to make sure that it fits within your expectations when it comes to ethics and compliance?
Yeah, on the guardrails piece, I always have been using the analogy of the internet and the World Wide Web. 10, 15 years ago, some organizations took the tack that we're just going to ban it. Nobody's going to be allowed to use the internet on our systems, and that proved to be not a sustainable policy. I think the same is true for AI. It's happening. But so you have to ask a lot of really hard questions and turn over a lot of rocks and figure out what's going on so that you can properly construct something. Because it's the same as the World Wide Web was 15 years or 25 years ago. Uh, Time is slipping away. You're not going to stop it. So you have to figure out how to manage it. Let's uh let's put our AI agents and our technology into the closet now and talk a little bit about people. Adam, I do want to ask you, you know, where do you see the kind of the biggest disconnect between expectations and policy and the actual boots on the ground day-to-day behavior? And where do we have that gap?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think it actually ties back a little bit to something that Miriam mentioned earlier, which is I think when we have a lot of like people are so pressured to do their job. So when there's a lot of other, excessive training requests or things come in, that's where I think we rightfully get some resistance. But I think in terms when it comes to, policies between the gap between policies on paper and the policies kind of in practice. I've challenged myself and I really trying to challenge other people as well so that when we think about like a bit of paper, like that's the policy, I'm like, that is not the policy. The policy is what actually happens in practice. The bit of paper is our attempt to codify or write what we think the policy is, or frankly, what we would like it to be. And so I think it's the same with honestly like the rules of any sport. You may have the rules, but if the players aren't playing by the rules, if the referee isn't holding people accountable as well, you then have that big gap. And so one of the things I really think we need to have happen, it's engaging its leaders, managers, and supervisors. They really need to know what are our policies, what are the standards, why do they matter? And then one, they've got to make sure they're modeling the behavior. But two, when they see other people who are not acting in accordance with those, they have to hold them accountable. And also I think for leaders as well, it's making sure if Eric, if you and I work together, I'm like, hey Eric, I need you to go do this thing, making sure like, hang on, the intent of my message may be good, but there's all sorts of pressure that you're dealing with. So is the impact of my message the same as the intent? And so sometimes I think for leaders and managers and supervisors, it's reminding people, I want you to do this, whether it's competitive intelligence or whatever it's going to be. But to state the obvious, like we have standards around this. So I want to make sure you know that. And if I've said anything that you're not sure about, make sure I want you to come back and have that conversation with me or go speak to Miriam in compliance because I want to make sure that we're doing this in the right way. So those I think are some of the big challenges we're seeing, but also leadership is really they're the key, I think, to making sure that policies on paper really are the same as in practice.
To follow up on that, how can compliance equip or aid these leaders, these managers to be the role model and to be able to lead there?
I I think the way to do it is really it's to have conversations with as many leaders and managers as you can. You may not be able to have conversations with all leaders, managers, and supervisors, right? I work in an organization where we have tens of thousands of people. I will never be able to speak to every single one of them, but trying to have some of those conversations because the reality is everybody knows that ethics and compliance is important. You look at so many codes of conduct, and it's going to say your leader, your manager, they're in the best position to give you guidance. If you have an ethical question, go to your manager. They will be able to give you appropriate direction. That creates an expectation in the mind of your employees. They may then go to their manager, and the manager's like, I don't know, or I don't know how to handle those situations. So having conversations with people, or I've done things such as manager toolkits. What do you do when someone wants to raise a concern to you? How do you handle that situation? Who do you engage? Who do you reach out to? Or, what are the policies that people are going to have questions on? Gifts, meals, entertainment, travel. That's something that comes up a lot. So if you're a manager, kind of what are the points that we think people are going to come to you on? How do you think through those? And maybe even giving people some talking points. So trying to make it as easy as for them as possible, but making it practical, making it actionable. That's really, I think, how we can make this work in practice.
No, that all makes sense. Um, Kind of related, but doubling back to something we talked about earlier, which is working as a partner with the commercial side of the business rather than being the top cop or the medium cop, whatever, however compliance is negatively viewed in some organizations. The where are those fault lines? Where are the tensions with business, and where does that, in your experience, show up most, Miriam?
I think the challenge here is that what Adam was talking about the manager toolkits and how we're engaging managers and how we're getting them to connect with us and not enforce, but um, share the policies and procedures. But I think there's this disconnect between what the managers think is happening in the commercial organization and what the boots on the ground are really doing. So how do we make that connection with the boots on the ground, give them appropriate guidance, guardrails,
Mhm.
and create that environment, moving from the cop to the partner, create that environment that they can ask questions about those guardrails and where do they butt up against them? How does it apply to this scenario? But that they don't always have to go to their manager. Because I think, we then give the managers power over some of our ethics and compliance messages that they may not be equipped to have, but our code told them to go to their manager. So now they're
Yeah.
going to their manager, and their manager doesn't want to say, I don't know. So, how do we find that way to engage the boots on the ground, build a relationship, learn what's really happening, and provide appropriate guidance, whether that's black and white rules or guardrails or job aids or whatever it is, to help them stay within the appropriate regulatory framework and raise concerns and come to us to ask questions.
Yeah. No, I think it's all about the line of communication, and that's where the middle comes in, and a crafting the tools with the compliance team comes in, and then up the chain of command as well. Having leadership, uh, you know, guiding the ship in the appropriate direction so that everybody gets the same message. Um, we're coming up towards the end, guys, so I'm gonna ask you the hard questions. Well, I'm gonna ask you the hard question. I'm gonna ask you the question about success. But the first question is, where in the last year or two have you invested time or resources and it just didn't turn out? You didn't see the impact you expected from your initiative. Adam, you want to take that one? Take the hard one first.
Why'd you give me the hard one? Plus, these have all been hard questions, Eric. I'm not sure why you're saying you're starting with the hard ones now. No, I think, and I feel like my answer may sound incredibly arrogant. I really don't mean it to be, but I feel like I try a lot of things and they don't work. So I'm very comfortable killing projects or killing ideas because they're just not going to work at an early stage. So I think I try to be very aware of like the sunk cost bias and stop projects before they get too far. But I've done some weird things before. Like I put together what was meant to be like a short video. I use Canva, and so it was like meant to be like a kind of an 80s video game type thing, and there was like a DJ cat involved as well. I showed it to one of my colleagues, and he was like, "There's no way we're rolling this out. It's too weird. It's too far out there." And so I think there's just a lot of things that I'm very comfortable with. Not everything is going to be 100% successful. Actually, if I think if we're doing our jobs, if we're really thinking about being creative, most things probably won't succeed, and that's okay.
It's okay.
Think about it from a private equity perspective. They're not expecting 100% of their investments to really excel. They want a number of them to, and they want one or two out of every 10 to really succeed. And so I think there's just a lot of things, I could go back to my Power BI where, yeah, I don't think I've succeeded at being able to build out more dashboards. So that was a little bit of a failure. What it did help me though is when I have other people on my team who can build those out, now I'm a better communicator because I can say, well, could we do this? Could we add a slicer? What about this thing here? So I feel in many ways I'm always failing. There's always things I'm doing that are not going to work out. And I'm not ashamed of that because I see there's opportunity to learn, there's opportunity to adapt and to improve based on that.
Yeah. And,
To
and Miriam, to
capitalize
you?
on what Adam just said, the idea of failing fast and and the learning that comes from that. And I'm probably an oversharer in my world, but when I failed and I've learned, I want to tell everybody, hey, I did this. This was the outcome. You need to try something else.
No, I think that's a good point, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around AI. Even the hallucinations could be learning opportunities. We just have to make sure that we still have our hand involved, and we're not just relying, but even those misses can be learning opportunities. So now the happier question, which is what's worked in the last year or so, a change that you guys have made in the program that's moving the ball forward. Adam?
Back to me. Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm seeing working is rewriting a number of policies to really make them, I think, much more human centric. And that's something that I think really will be very helpful in the long run. I just think too many policies, it's about the shaming and blaming, and when something goes wrong, it's like, we're going to blame you. And I think one of the things I feel like has been a consistent theme throughout our conversation is, and I think Miriam really leads this with her program, is like changing the perception of compliance from being like a bitter medicine that stops the business to how do we make it something? It's almost like a vitamin or vitamin is my UK background showing up there that really I think enables culture and enables business results. So yeah, I think there's lots of things.
Miriam, what's something that you see moving things forward?
Well, obviously the Lego Series Play, which I
Yeah.
talked about and I'm very excited about. And the Lego Series Play is just a methodology for engaging people. It is obvious that Adam, Eric, and I are outgoing folk, and you put us in a room and we're going to speak up. Everybody in this virtual room can think of somebody on their team who is not outspoken, who is not very willing to share their opinion. And the model is everybody builds, everybody has a story, everybody shares their story. So it creates the environment to bring everybody in, which I don't think compliance has done in the past very well. So that is one. And two, we have been on this journey of simple to operate, moving from thousands of pages of policies, procedures, guidance, whatever you want to call it, to a much shorter, simpler, principles-based guidance. And at first, my tentacles went up and we're like, oh no, if we don't document
Yeah.
it, we haven't covered ourselves. But I really do think now that as we've rolled out more and more of this simple guidance, it has created an environment where people are more willing to speak up because there wasn't FAQ number 37, but they
Hmm.
have FAQ number 37 and they don't want to do the wrong thing. So they make that phone call or they send that Teams message.
Yeah.
Um, So it has become much more positive than even when I joined and we were on this journey. I was like, "Ooh, I don't know." But I do really, I've really bought in as we've moved through it, and I see the benefits. It's short, it's sweet. You can get the information you need, and there's contacts for where you have those. I don't have the information I need, and oh, by the way, we're continuing to adapt it. So when we have the question 6 times, it needs to go into the guidance because it's something people need.
Yeah. No, I've been an evangelist for simplifying these standards because again, it all goes back to communication. And whether it's your standalone policy on anti-corruption, or whether it's the code of conduct, or whether it's, name your policy procedure FAQ, you know, guidance document, whatever. If it doesn't speak to the audience that needs to hear it, it's completely useless. Ask, I always tell people this, ask the lawyers why. Why does this have to be this way? Because oftentimes the lawyers won't have an answer for that. Because if the goal of the policy is to communicate expectations and risk, and you aren't doing that to your audience, you aren't providing that for your audience, then it's a failure. Okay, one last question to both of you, and you got 30 seconds to answer. What's one piece of advice? What's your parting piece of advice to compliance leaders in 2026 right now? Miriam?
Keep asking the questions, keep building the relationships, and keep engaging in environments like this where you can learn from others.
Great. Adam, you get the last word.
I get the last word. I think what I would say is our focus needs to be on tech-enabled human-centric programs. And I think it's looking at how technology can help us, but that is not the purpose, that is not the focus. Be very human-centric in how you're thinking about your programs. Even one thing I'm looking at is how can we engage our neurodivergent employees in a much more effective way? You just talked about communication, how we write policies, even the font you use for your employees who are dyslexic, all of that can make a difference. So tech-enabled, human-centric is the way to go.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. And both those of you in the audience that have been listening, and Adam and Miriam, can't thank you enough, and hope to see you guys soon.